Hilchos Pesulei Hamukdashin Perek Shmoina Asar. The laws of disqualified sacrifices, chapter 18. This is the last chapter about improper thought when it comes to holy sacrifices. And really, it's not about any of the laws anymore that make the disqualification. Those were the last 5 chapters. Which thoughts make which types of levels of disqualification. Some are puzzle, some are pigul, some are just regularly disqualified, some are fully rejected. Today we're going to kind of learn about the consequences. Now that you have pigul or puzzle, what's the laws pertaining to such sacrifices? And once we talk about that, we're also going to talk about what happens to a sacrifice that becomes noisar, left over, past its time frame, and tameh. What happens if sacrificial meat becomes impure, or if a person becomes impure and he wants to eat sacrificial meat. So that's going to be the big topic today, to discuss basically the consequences of what happens when a sacrifice becomes disqualified. So the Rambam begins with the following halacha. Halacha aleph, kol ha-mechashev, machshava she'eino nechaina b'kadashim, any Kohen that has an improper thought when it comes to sacrificial meat, besides the fact that his thought is going to lead to negative consequences because the sacrifice gets disqualified, but just the thought itself is actually forbidden. He transgresses a negative prohibition. It's a very rare concept. We don't find in the Torah a lot that there's a prohibition against what you think. Maybe one other one is about idol worship. You cannot think how to pursue idol worship. Here you're not allowed to think a thought that will disqualify a sacrifice. Because it says, lo yechashev. Now, lo yechashev in context is talking about a case where a person has in mind to eat the sacrifice past its time frame. All that the Torah says is, lo yeratza hamakrivaisai. The Kohen who offers it, it's not going to be acceptable. Lo yechashev loy, literally it means it's not going to be counted for him. Pigul yiyah, it's going to be rejected. But the word lo yechashev, besides from meaning it's not going to be counted, it also has the root as machshava, as thought. As though Torah is saying you shouldn't think these thoughts. As the Rambam says, Mipi Ashmuel lamdu, from tradition we learn, Shebichlal din zeh, included in these words, lo yechashev, included in that is shelo yafsed hakadashim b'machshava, that you shouldn't actively, with your thought, destroy sacrifices. Shahadei zedayme lematul mum b'kadashim. It's equivalent to taking by hand or by utensil and making a blemish in a sacrifice. What happens when you blemish a sacrifice? You can't bring it anymore. When you have an improper thought, what happens? You can't bring it anymore. So it's literally like that for a Kohen to, for a Kohen to have an improper thought of like putting a mum in a sacrifice. Afal pikein einei loike. We can't hold you accountable so much that you get lashes. She'ena machshava maisa, because thought, in the end of the day, is not action. And in Torah, we only get lashes for actions, not for thoughts. So while it's forbidden, there's no physical consequence. Halacha Gimel. In the last few days, we've talked about different types of disqualification. Sometimes an improper thought makes a sacrifice puzzle, just regularly disqualified. And sometimes it makes it pigul. So that's the higher level of rejection. So we have to know what are the prohibitions involved in eating puzzle meat versus eating pigul meat. Halacha Gimel kol karban shenemar shehu puzzle. Any sacrifice about which we said that it's regularly disqualified, bein shenifsal b'machshava, whether it became disqualified by thought, which was the last couple of days we saw some examples of that, bein b'maisa, or an action disqualified it, which is the whole first section of these laws. All types of problematic actions that disqualify sacrifices. Bein she'era by davar shepsalei, or something happened to it which disqualified it. Kol ha'oichel mimenu kazayis b'mezid loike. The punishment for eating such meat willfully is lashes. Shenemar, it says, lo yiseichal kol toyeva. In the context of kosher or not kosher, the Torah has a verse that says you shouldn't eat anything that's disgusting. So what does it mean, anything that's disgusting? All the specifics of non-kosher are listed right after that. So this verse has to be teaching something new. So the Rambam says, Mipi Ashmuel lamdu, from tradition we learn, she'eina kasuv mazir ela al Pesulei Hamukdashin. This verse is referring specifically and only to disqualified sacrifices. To'eva means, as Rashi explains, sheti'avti lecha, anything that Hashem declared to be disgusting, in the sense of sacrifice, the sense of holy meat, in which if a sacrifice became disqualified because of a thought or an action or a happenstance, it becomes forbidden, and if you do, you get lashes if you eat it. Halacha hey, b'chein kadashim shehutal b'hem mum, also sacrifices that get a blemish, but get a blemish meaning not naturally. Somebody put it there. Someone actively hurt them. If somebody eats an olive-sized portion from their meat, he gets lashes. They are included in these words. Kol ta'eva, disgusting things, abominations. And it stays that way till another mum comes on them naturally, is born to them just out of circumstance. And then you can eat them in their status of having a blemish, as we explained. And any time there's a doubtful disqualification, of course we can't hold you accountable because it might not be disqualified. So you can't give lashes for eating such a thing. Now that's all for puzzle. What if we rise to the next level of pigul? Any sacrifice which becomes pigul is only one way to become pigul, an improper time thought. As we explained, the Kohen thinks he wants to eat or offer part of the sacrifice outside the proper time. If the carbon became pigul, chayav kares. Now it's an even higher level. If you eat an olive-sized portion willfully, no lashes, you get excision. Shenemar, because it says in the pasuk, back at the first verse that we quoted before, this is the verse talking about pigul. It's a case where the person thought to eat it past the time frame. Says the Torah, a soul that eats from it will carry its sin. This term, avoina tisa, in Torah always means kares. It always means excision. And if you eat such meat inadvertently, then like every time there's a sin that carries kares, if you do it by mistake, you have to bring the standard sin offering. Halacha Zayin says that Rambam a very important caveat. Ein chayavin kares ela ala chilas dvarim shehutru. Okay, let me just say it as more of an introduction. Every sacrifice has two parts. What's called the matir and the mutar. Matir means the part of the sacrifice which permits the rest to be eaten by the altar or by people. The mutar means the part that's actually eaten by the mizbeach or by people. So let's say classically, the Rambam will actually give an example of a carbon mincha, a flour offering. Right? The flour offering has two parts. First you have the kmitza. You must take the handful. That's the matir. Because when you take that and you put it on the mizbeach, that now matir, that now permits the rest of the flour to be eaten by the kohanim. And that's called the mutar. The leftover is called the thing that's become permitted. Same thing with let's say, an animal sacrifice. The blood is the matir. When you sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach, that permits the rest of the meat to be eaten by regular people. So the Rambam says a very big rule. When it comes to pigul, you're only held liable for eating the mutar. In other words, the parts of the sacrifice that would usually become permitted by virtue of the acts that are performed with the matir, with the parts that permit the sacrifice. Bein la'adam, bein la'mizbeach, whether things that have become permitted to be eaten by the mizbeach or by people. But if you eat from the part of the sacrifice which itself is permitting the rest of the sacrifice to be eaten, if you don't get the excision, you only get lashes, Hamukdashin, as though you ate any other disqualified sacrifice that's not pigul. Pigul only applies to the mutar, the part of the sacrifice which becomes permitted. Ketzad, let's see an example of this, which we just described, the mincha. Mincha shenispagla. You have a flour offering which became pigul because the Kohen had in mind an improper time thought. If you ate the olive-sized portion from the remnant, that's the mutar, the part that's become permitted typically. If you ate that willfully, chayav kares, you'll get the full excision. But if you ate from the actual kmitza, the actual 3 fingers full of flour, or the frankincense, chayav kares, you're not liable to excision. Because it's those things that are permitting the remnants of the flour to be eaten by people. Same thing if you have an animal sacrifice, which became pigul. If a person would eat an olive-sized portion from the meat that's typically eaten by people, or even from the parts that would go onto the mizbeach, that's the part that's eaten by the mizbeach, or the flesh of a burnt offering, chayav kares, for those you're liable to excision, because those are all the mutar. But if you would eat an olive-sized portion from the blood, you're not liable for pigul. Shahadam matir because the blood is the matir. It's what's making the inside parts of the animal, the fats and the meat, to be allowed to be offered on the mizbeach. And those parts, when they'll be offered on the mizbeach, they will permit the meat to be eaten by people. And the blood of the burnt offering is what's allowing the meat to be eaten by the mizbeach. So if you eat the meat, that's the mutter. If you eat the blood, that's the matir. There's no problem of pigul. It's the blood of a sin offering of a bird. Sprinkling of the blood that allows it to be eaten by the kohanim, the meat. And the blood of the bird burnt offering is what allows its meat to be eaten by the mizbeach. And the blood of the burnt offerings, the burnt sin offerings that are burnt, not eaten, is what allows their innards to be eaten by the mizbeach. Therefore, if you eat the innards, you would be obligated on account of pigul, because that's a mutter, not a matir. When it comes to flour offerings, as we said just before, it's the actual 3 fingers full and the frankincense that are allowing the rest of the flour to be eaten by the kohanim. On Shavuos, we discussed at length yesterday, there's 2 lambs and there's 2 breads. It's the 2 lambs that are the matir and the 2 breads that are the mutter. The offering of the 2 lambs is what allows the bread to be eaten. And therefore, you're only obligated on pigul for the bread, not for the lambs. The 2 spoons of frankincense are the matir for the showbread. So the showbread is what you'd be obligated for pigul, not the spoons. But if you have things that have no matir, nothing is making them permitted, meaning the meat of burnt sin offerings and flour offerings, they cannot become pigul because they don't have a matir, so you can't divide it from the matir, in which case they themselves also are not subject to the laws of pigul. Knowing these principles, now we can list. It will be kind of like a restatement of many of the things we just saw, but in summary, we can now see what are the things that you would never be liable to on account of pigul. So that's what we just said. This 3 fingers full on the frankincense, that's a matir, so that's not going to become pigul. The hakatoides, incense, it's a standalone thing, it has nothing to do with eating, never becomes pigul. The hadam v'hayayin, blood and wine, bein yayin haba iman nesachim, bein yayin haba bifnei atzmei, whether it's wine coming as part of libations or being offered on its own, these are not subject to pigul. U'menaches hanisrafes kulan, shahari ein lahem kaimetz lahatiran, and the flour offerings which are all burnt, the ones that don't have a kaimetz, to permit them. Like when you bring mincha of a kohen. Torah says kohen's flour offering is totally burnt. There's no kmitza. So there's no stage of matir and mutter. It just all goes on the mizbeach. Same thing the mincha of libations in general. When you bring flour with a sacrifice, there's no prior stage of matir. That's just what it is. It goes on the mizbeach. So it cannot become pigul. Ubisar chatois hanisrafa is the meat of sin offerings which are burnt. The leg shemen shel mitzayra, and the small amount of oil that the mitzayra, the person who has taras lesions, has to bring upon becoming pure. V'im taimar, says the Rambam, if you'll ask me, v'halidam ha'asham matirai. What do you mean the oil doesn't have a matir? It does. The blood that comes with the guilt offering which the mitzayra brings is what allows the oil to be consumed by the kohen. Says the Rambam, einoi tolibay. Even though it sounds like it, if you actually look into it, one is not dependent on the other. As will be explained in the proper place, dealing with these halachas, the mitzayra is allowed to bring his guilt offering on one day and the amount of oil on a whole different day. So clearly they're not interdependent. And therefore, it's not considered to have a matir, and therefore it doesn't become pigul. Halacha tes, that kind of concludes the conversation about pigul, and now we move to noiser. Noiser is leftover meat. Meat that's actually been left over past its time frame. Halacha tes, asur lehoiser mipsar hakadashim la'achar zman achilasan. It's forbidden for a Jew to leave sacrificial meat past its time frame, that it could be eaten. Shanemar bekarban toida, the example, or the one place it says it clearly, is by the Thanksgiving offering. It says, lo yisaysiru mimenu ad boker. Here it is. Right? Eat it on that day. Do not leave it over till the morning. And from there we learn, V'hu hadin l'shar kadashim kulan. The same applies to all other sacrifices. They have their own time frame. You cannot leave it past the time frame. However, if you do, you don't get lashes. Because Torah, nitak either means attached it or allowed it to be fixed by a positive commandment. The Torah says, when it comes to the Korban Pesach, that whatever is left over to the morning, you should burn in fire. In other words, since Torah allows you to remedy the prohibition, so we don't give you lashes for the prohibition. The other classic example for this is robbery. When a person robs something, so the Torah right away says, "V'heishivas hagzela asher gazal." You should return the stolen object. So since you could always return it, so as long as you're holding on to it, we can't really hold you accountable because you might return it. Same thing over here. You left over the meat. It doesn't stand on its own because you could remedy it, and you have to remedy it by burning it. What if you do? You ate the meat of leftover sacrificial meat. B'mezid, if you did it on purpose, chayev kares, it's like pigul. You're liable to excision. B'sheigig mevichatos kvua, if you do it inadvertently, you bring the standard sin offering. Shenemar, because it says, v'oichlav avoino yisa, those that eat it, referring to Neisar, will carry their sin, ki es kodesh Hashem chilel, because they have desecrated the holiness of God, v'nichrasa, and the soul will become cut off. So clearly, kares, for eating Neisar. When is it called leftover? At what point in the day do we say now the meat is leftover? So we have to remember what's the time frame. If it's the holiest of holy sacrifices, where their law is that you can really eat it for that day and the whole following night. So when does it become nicer? By dawn. When the next morning dawn arrives, so the night is over, so it's nicer. If it's a lighter level sacrifices, what's the law there? What's the time frame for Kachim Kalim? The time frame is day, night, and the next day. So the moment that the sun sets on the second day, the beginning of the third night, that's when it becomes nicer. Asks the Rambam, where do we find Torah warning against eating pigul and noiser? What does that mean, warning? So in general, there's a rule in halacha, ein einshin ela im kein mazhirin. We cannot give you a punishment unless there's a clear warning prohibition in the Torah, which means that whenever Torah describes just a punishment for something, you have to find somewhere else in the Torah where Torah says don't do it. See, all it says over here, what does it say here? It says, don't leave it over to the morning, and if you eat it, you get punished. But if you look at the words, it doesn't say don't eat it anywhere. Same with pigul. What does it say about pigul? It says, if you have the wrong thought, it becomes pigul, and if you eat it, you get kares. Torah only says the punishment, but where's the warning? Where does it say don't eat it? So the Rambam says, "V'heichan hizir akasuv ala pigul v'ala neiser." Where do we find in Torah an expression which would imply that you shouldn't eat this stuff? Bamiluyim. This we find in the miluyim, in the inaugural services of the Mishkan, when the tabernacle was first established, and Hashem gave some early instructions to the Kohanim. There you can find an indication of a prohibition. Sha'arei nemar sham. What does it say over there? Lo yoichal, or lo ye'achel, ki kodesh hu. It should not be eaten because it's holy. What's that verse talking about? Look at the beginning. It says, V'im yivaser, mibsar hamiluyim u'min alechem ad haboker. If any of the meat of these sacrifices, the inaugural sacrifices, are left over to the morning, you have to burn it, and here it says clearly, lo ye'achel, no eating. So even though, of course, the context here is a one-time context, it's never happened again, it was just the inaugural service, but here you see a general prohibition. This is a general warning for any meat which becomes prohibited in its holy state, that it's forbidden to eat it. And now we can attach this to the other verses that say, if you eat pigul, you get kares, if you eat nicer, you get kares, because you already have the warning of lo ye'achel ki kodesh. Halacha Yud Aleph, pigul v'hanoisar, because of this, because they're both included in the same warning, so both pigul and noisar mitzdarfin zeim zel likazayis. They can combine to create a prohibited amount. We said before, if you eat a full olive-sized portion of pigul, you get kares. You eat a full olive-sized portion of noisar, you get kares. What if you eat a combined kazayis? Half an olive-sized portion of pigul, half an olive-sized portion of noisar. Since they are given in the same warning, they combine. V'chola pigulim v'hanesarin mitzdarfin. All kinds of pigul, all kinds of neisar can be combined for this purpose. And now we come to the third topic of conversation in the chapter, tuma, impurity. Halacha Yud Bey is asar letame es hakadashim or lesabiv lahem tuma. It's forbidden to directly transmit impurity to sacrificial meat or to indirectly cause a sacrificial meat to become impure. Shahare paisla, because by making them impure, you disqualify them. Nevertheless, if you bring impurity to sacrificial meat, you don't get lashes. That is if a person makes it impure. Aval adam toher she'achal kezayis mikadashim shenitmu leike. But if you're pure and you then eat the meat that's become impure, you do get lashes. Shenemar, because it says, and here's the verse, v'habasar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo ye'achel. Meat which touches anything impure shall not be eaten. V'hu adin l'shar karbanis. In context, this is talking about the peace offering, the shlamim. But again, we learn from here to everywhere. V'hu adin l'shar karbanis. The same applies to all sacrifices. Sheim achal kazayis milevainas hamincha. Let's say, for example, you would eat an olive-sized portion from the frankincense and a flour offering, shanitma. If it becomes impure after becoming sanctified in a vessel, like you get lashes. Doesn't matter if the sacrificial meat became impure before achieving atonement, after achieving atonement, whether it became impure with what we call a primary source of impurity, or a baby, a child source of impurity, a lower level of impurity, which we're going to explore in detail in the Rambam's 10th book. As long as it's a biblical source of impurity. If it became impure through rabbinic impurity, we can't give you biblical lashes, but we'll give you rabbinic lashes. You also only get lashes if you eat the meat after the blood has been sprinkled. But if you ate it before the sprinkling, we can't hold you accountable for eating holy sacrificial meat that's impure, because it's not fully sacrificial meat yet till the sprinkling of blood is done. But again, the rabbis will give you lashes, just not biblically accountable. That is for a pure person who's eating impure meat. What if it's an impure person eating pure meat? Kol adam shenitma tuma. Any person that becomes impure in a way that if he would enter the temple, he'd be getting excision. And such a person ate an olive-sized portion from sacrificial meat, whether the meat is pure or impure, if he does it purposely, he gets excision. Because it says in the very next verse there, if a soul will eat meat from the peace offering while his impurity is on him, he gets excision. And if he eats it inadvertently, then he has to bring what's called a fluctuating sacrifice. Depending on his means, he either brings an animal, birds, or a flour offering. Now that Rambam said, how do we know that it's talking about the person's impurity? So you have to really kind of appreciate the Hebrew grammar here. See, in this verse, it discusses a person and meat. It says v'hanefesh asher teichal basar mizeh v'chashlamim, and then it says v'tum asay alav. Its impurity was on it. What's impurity was on what? I just translated it as the person. If a person eats meat while his impurity is on him, while he is impure, but it could equally be translated as on the basar. A person who eats meat, that its impurity, that the meat is impure. So how do I know, says the Rambam, that this verse is talking about tumas haguf, where the person is impure? So the Rambam answers, look at the next verse. Shenemar, because it says, v'nefesh ki siga b'chol tameh. If a soul, if a person, touches anything impure, b'tumas adam, ay b'behema tmeya, ay b'chol sheketz tameh, either a person that's impure, or an animal that's impure, an insect that's impure, v'ochal mibsar zevach hashlamim asher la'Hashem v'nichrisa. And then he eats from the meat of the shlamim, he'll get cut off. So here you see clearly that it's talking about the person, not the meat. And again, this is all talking about a shlamim, but from here we learn to all sacrifices. Again, we have to ask the question, where's the warning? All Torah says here is the punishment. if you eat such meat, you get excision. But where does it say, don't eat such meat? The context of the warning is for a woman who gave birth. If you look at the verses of the woman who gives birth, what does it say? She's impure and pure for a certain amount of time. Throughout the entire period, till she becomes fully pure, she cannot touch anything holy. And we learn from tradition that this touching is not really touching, it's eating. It means that a person who's impure should not eat holy things before they go to the mikveh. So there it says, again, it says don't do it. And so now we can link that don't do it to the punishment that we mentioned before of excision. If a person were to eat sacrificial meat after going to mikveh, but before sunset or before bringing his offering, right? In impurity, we have this a few times before. There's going to the mikveh, there's waiting till sunset, and sometimes you have to even bring a sacrifice the next day. So even once you go to the mikveh, you're pure in some form, but not fully pure. So what if you ate sacrificial meat in that interim time? It says, I'm going to hold you accountable enough that you'll get lashes, but not excision. Because it says in that verse that we quoted before, Vitum asay alav, his impurity has to be on him. Ad shatia koltum asay alav, the impurity with the full strength has to be on him. That's when you're held liable fully. If even part of the impurity went away, you went to mikveh, so you're good. Or at least good enough not to get excision, but to get lashes. Tesvav haya tameh b'tumah shel divrayim. If you were only impure with a rabbinic impurity and you went to the mikveh, so no lashes, and needless to say, no excision. The rabbis will give you the rabbinic lashes. If we're talking about sacrifices that have a matir, that have a part of them which makes them permitted, then you're not held liable for eating that in a state of impurity, until you eat from it after the matir has already been brought. But if you were to eat the meat before the blood was sprinkled, let's say, we're not going to hold you accountable for an impure person who eats sacrificial meat. Because this is the rule. Any sacrifice that has a matir, that has a permitter, Ein chayavin alav mishum pigul, ay mishum neisar, ay mishum tameh, ad sheyikrivu matirav kil chasan. All the stuff we discussed today, pigul, neisar, and impurity, you aren't held accountable till the matir is fully offered. The chol she'ein le matirin, but if it's an article of sacrificial elements that has no matir, kevan shekadosh b'kli chayavin alav mishum tuma. The moment it becomes sanctified on a utensil is the moment you become liable for impurity. Afilu nitma habasar kedem she'itam ya'achel, even if the meat became impure before the person became impure. Hoyel v'karvu hamatirin v'achar kach achal. So long as the matter was offered and then he ate the meat, chayav karesh, you're liable to excision. V'chenim achal mibsar chatayis hanisrafes v'utamei achar shenizrak damam. Same thing. A person was impure and he eats from sin offerings that are burnt before, after the blood was sprinkled. Hariz chayav karesh, you're liable to excision, because again, the matir in this context was offered. Halacha yud zayin kvar nisbar lecha. It's already been explained to you. Sha'af dvarim she'en chayavin alein mishum pigul. That even things which have no pigul applied to them, chayavin alein mishum neser v'tamei, it's possible to have an obligation of leftover meat or impurity. In other words, pigul and neser and tamei don't have to cancel each other out. Even if pigul is not possible, neser and tamei is possible. Ketzah, what's an example of that? Dvarim she'en lahem matirim. Things that have no matir, that have no permitter. Ein chayavin alein mishum pigul, v'chayavin alein mishum neser v'tamei. You wouldn't be liable on them for pigul, but you would be liable for neser and tamei. V'chein hamatirin atzman, the matir itself, the kaimetz, let's say, the levaina itself. Even though we just explained today, there's no pigul obligation there. Chayavin alein mishum neser v'tamei. You are liable for leftover meat and impure meat. Chutz min adam, except for blood. Blood, you'll never be held accountable for more than one thing. The prohibition of eating blood. It's not pigul, not neser, nothing. Only blood. If an impure person ate not sacrificial meat, he ate the parts of the sacrifice that go on the mizbeach. That's what he ate. He's still liable to excision. It's like eating regular sacrificial meat. If he ate a Passover offering which wasn't roasted fully, which is itself prohibited. Or he eats the bread of a Thanksgiving offering, which the challah wasn't taken from it. They're still considered somewhat sacrificial, even though you wouldn't be able to offer it properly as a sacrifice. Right, a Passover that's raw, you can't eat. A toida that doesn't have challah, you can't offer. But you, being impure, shouldn't have eaten that. And then another rule: in one act of eating, you can't eat meat that's both pigul and noiser. Those terms are mutually exclusive in one object. Because what's pigul? Pigul is pre-sacrifice, right? While you were offering it, you disqualified it with an improper thought. It's not even a sacrifice. It doesn't do any atonement. What's noiser? Noiser means the sacrifice was brought properly. You left it over past the time frame, and now it's noiser. So basically, a pigul can never become noiser. If pigul is there, then it's just not a sacrifice. If noiser is there, it means it was a good sacrifice. So you can't have pigul and noiser in one piece. Now there are exceptions, different cases where it could happen. That's why the Rambam uses the word achila. In one eating, in one act of eating, if you touch one olive-sized portion, you can be sure that it's not both pigul and noiser. One kazayis can't be both pigul and noiser. Chaf, ha-pigul v'ha-noiser v'ha-tameh sheblalan zevazeh v'achalon. If you mix different types of prohibitions, pigul, noiser, and tameh, and you ate them all, chayav, you're liable. Afal pisha riba min al chavera, even if one type is the majority, einay mevatle, it doesn't cancel it. She'einay yisurin mevatlin zeh. Prohibitions don't cancel each other out, right? We have a whole bunch of chapters about taruvis. If you mix chametz and regular things, or if you mix non-kosher food and kosher food, many times the kosher food could overpower the non-kosher food. But if they're both prohibited entities, they don't overpower. Each one is judged on its own. If for whatever reason, somehow, pigul, noiser, or tameh meat was offered on the mizbeach, mishamashla ha'ur beruban, paka isuran mehen. Once the fire caught onto most of them, the prohibition is revoked. It's no longer pigul, noiser, or tameh. Parts offered on the mizbeach and other meat could combine to an olive-sized portion, whether it's a burnt offering or other sacrifices, to hold you accountable for pigul, noiser, or tameh, because in this context, whatever the mizbeach eats or the person eats is all considered the same unit for disqualified sacrifices. If a sacrifice became pigul or was left over, the achal mimenu, and you ate an inedible part of it. Remember in chapter 14 we had a whole list of things that are inedible from sacrifices. So what if you ate one of those parts? Min ha'or, the hide, I mean ha'marok, or the gravy which it's cooked in, I mean ha'tavlin, or the spices, I mean ha'alol. Alol is the meat that's left over in the skinning, I mean ha'mura, or from the thin membrane between the skin and the flesh, min hagidim, or from sinews or blood vessels, min hakarnayim, min hatlafayim, horns or hoofs, min hatziparnayim, min hachartayim, from the nails or the beak, or min hanoitzo, or min beitzei ha'oif, or feathers or eggs from a bird, ein chayav kares. You're not liable to excision. That's not the regular parts, the roy la'achila of a sacrifice. If a person who was impure ate one of these things from a kosher sacrifice, no biblical excision, but there is rabbinic lashes. If a person ate from a fetus, an unborn fetus, or a placenta, if its mom had become pigul or noiser or tameh, eating from these units would also make you liable to whatever punishment it is, as though you ate from any other part of the meat. If a sacrifice is offered by a goy, by an idol-worshipping Gentile, the special laws of pigul, noiser, and tameh don't apply to them. And also blood of any sacrifice cannot become pigul. Frankincense, incense, regular incense, and wood, eating them for whatever reason, why you would eat incense is beyond me, but if you eat them, you're not liable to excision, not as pigul, not as noiser, and not if you are in an impure state, bodily speaking.